In the hard winter of 1964, Marta Vale was 62 years old, and she was left with $164 and a dead creamery. She thought, that winter, that she had known the man who had married into her family, her husband's brother Silas, closed and quiet and strange as he was. She was wrong. She had not known him at all, and it would take a forgotten cold vault behind a boarded aging cellar and a whole hard spring of reading what he had written in the dark before she understood the size of the thing she had been wrong about. It began with a door closing that she had walked through every working morning for 31 years. Marta had made the butter and kept the books at the Kestrel Ford Creamery since she was 31, back when the cooperative still churned the cream of 40 dairies in the Two Rivers Valley, and the whole town lived by the milk wagons, her whole working life bound to the sour sweet smell of cream and the rattle of the cans on the loading dock. She had married a Vale, a herdsman named Corwin, and buried him 7 years back when the winter took his heart, and after that the creamery was all the marriage she had left, and she had believed, the way a person believes the floor will hold, that it would keep her until she was old and set her down gently at the end. The receiver's name was Wallace Prine, and he had come up from the county seat with a briefcase and a good overcoat and a way of talking that never quite landed on a person's face, and he did the thing the court had decided to do anyway, on a Thursday, in the creamery office with the little stove ticking between them. Marta would remember afterward that he had a paper ready before she poured the coffee, which is how you know a thing has already been decided. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "I want you to know the receivership thinks the world of you. 31 years on the churns. Nobody's forgetting that." He turned the paper a quarter turn toward her, the way a man does when he wants you to sign a thing without quite handing it to you. But the co-op doesn't pay anymore. The courts ordered it wound up, effective the end of the month. The plant closes for good, and that means, I'm sorry to say it, that we won't be needing a butter maker here past the 1st. There's a severance, to see you settled. The court wanted to do right by you. There's still cream coming in off this creek, Marta said. Her voice sounded strange to her, very level, very far away. I set 40 pounds of butter not 2 weeks ago. Mr. Prine, I ran this creamery through the drought of 46 and the flood of 52. What do you mean, wind it up? Where are the valley dairies supposed to sell their milk? Where am I to go? I know, Prine said, and he had the grace to look at the stove instead of at her. I know it's hard. 31 years. He slid the envelope across. It's a fair figure, Mrs. Vale, more than the receivership strictly owes. We wanted to see you comfortable while you settle somewhere down the valley. Marta opened the envelope and did the arithmetic in a single breath. It was not fair. It was the smallest lawful thing, dressed as a kindness, and after the last of what she owed on her rented rooms and the doctor's bill from Corwin's long dying, it would leave her with something close to $170 and no work and no place. She did not say any of that. There was no use saying arithmetic to a man who had already spent it. You had this drawn up before you crossed the creek, she said instead. Prine did not answer that, which was its own answer. I'll close out the books, Marta said, and she stood, and did not shake his hand, and went out onto the loading dock where the wind came down off the ridge and the frozen creek ran silent past the silent plant, and looked at the little factory she had kept for 31 years, and understood that at 62, for the first time in her adult life, she was a woman with nothing to do the next morning. She had $164 when the last of it was counted. She sat that evening in her rented rooms above the feed store with the money in an envelope on the table and tried to make the arithmetic come out to something that was not fear. And it would not. 62 years old, a widow, no work, and a landlord who would want the next month by the 10th. She did not weep. She sat very still and thought that a person could give 31 years of honest, unthanked work to a thing, and be walked out of it in an afternoon, and find the world had already locked the doors behind her. And then, 5 days later, her husband's brother Silas died. and the smallness of her life got smaller and, though she did not yet know it, turned entirely around. Silas Vale had been the cheesemaker at Kestrel Ford before Marta ever came, and when the co-op cut the cheese line and then the whole plant to butter only, it was Silas who kept the aging cellar while Marta worked the churn floor. The two of them the last of the creamery, working 100 feet apart for 20 years while he never once said a word to her that was not the business of the co-op. He was her husband's older brother, and he had stood silent at Corwin's grave and silent at every Christmas she ever asked him to. A gaunt, shut, solitary man who lived alone in the manager's rooms after the co-op stopped paying him, growing stranger and quieter, coming into town for coal and lamp oil and little else, a man the people of Kestrel Ford regarded the way they regarded the dark. Creamery at the edge of the creek with a vague unease and no curiosity at all. He left no will that anyone could find. He left, the county clerk told Marta when she came in about the burial, exactly one thing that stood in his name: the Kestrel Ford Creamery and the ground it sat on, and it was not so much left to her as left around her neck, because it came with a lien. Back taxes, the clerk said. He was a decent young man named Pruitt, and he did not enjoy his work that morning any more than Prine had enjoyed his. The creamery's been carried delinquent a good while. Mrs. Vale, the county condemned the structure 2 years back. The roof's caved, the churn floor's rotting, it's a hazard, and there's a demolition notice filed against it. You're the nearest thing to kin he had, so the parcel falls to you if you want it, but subject to the lien. The back taxes come to $164. Marta almost laughed, and the laugh, if it had come out, would have frightened her, so she held it. $164, near enough the exact figure Wallace Prine had walked her out the door with, as if the world had counted out precisely what it would cost to leave her with nothing at all and handed her a ruined creamery to spend it on. "And if I don't want it?" she asked. "Then it's forfeit to the county for the taxes, and the county pulls it down." Pruitt hesitated. "There's already a party interested, I'll be honest. The Meridian Dairy Combine's been asking after that parcel and the creek ground that runs with it. They'd likely settle the lien and take it off the county's hands, and you'd walk away clear. Some would say that's the sensible course. It's a heap of trouble, that creamery, and no use to a soul." Marta sat in the county office and thought about the sensible course. She thought about Silas Vale, who had never in 20 years said a kind word to her and had stood at Corwin's grave with his jaw working and said nothing at all. She did not owe him tenderness. He had given her none. But he was Corwin's blood, the last of the Vales, and the creamery was the last thing her husband's people had ever held, and she could not let it be pulled down for scrap while a dairy combine settled his debts and called it a mercy. "I'll pay the taxes," Marta said. Pruitt blinked. "Mrs. Vale, that's every cent of $164 for a condemned creamery you can't live in and can't sell for what you'd put in it. I'm not sure you understand. I understand arithmetic better than most in this county." "Mr. Pruitt," Marta said, not unkindly, "and I've decided. Draw the papers, I'll pay it today." And so, in the space of 5 days, Marta Vale went from a woman with $164 and no property to a woman with no money at all and one dead creamery, condemned and slated for demolition, and the whole of Kestrel Ford agreed that grief and shock had knocked the sense clean out of poor Marta Vale. The town was kind about it, in the way towns are kind, which is to say it had opinions. The women who had carried their cream to the platform beside her for 30 years brought what they could, and told her, gently and unanimously, that she must not throw good sense after bad, that the creamery was a ruin and a danger, and the combine would still buy it so she could walk away with something in her pocket instead of nothing. And within a week, the parties with a reason to want that creek ground began to come around, one by one, wearing their concern for her like a good coat. The land agent came first. His name was Emery Fisk. He acted for the Meridian Dairy Combine, and he was smooth and sorry and very quick with a figure. He sat in Marta's rented rooms and told her how very sorry he was for her losses. Both so close together, and then he came to it. "Now, Mrs. Vale, I won't insult you by pretending this is a social call," Fisk said, smiling. "The company I represent has an interest in that parcel, the creek ground, mainly, and the plant site. The creamery itself is worthless to us. We'd as soon it came down. But we're prepared to make you a fair offer for the whole parcel, taxes settled. Deed clear. Cash in hand. It would put right this dreadful season you've had. $800. $800. Nearly 5 times what Marta had left for a ruin she had owned a week. She felt the pull of it, the sensible warm pull, the way you feel the pull of sleep. It was a floor under a woman with no floor at all. "That's a great deal of money," Marta said slowly, "for a worthless creamery you mean to pull down." "It's for the parcel," Fisk said, a shade too smoothly. "The company likes to hold ground along the cold springs. Good water's a fine thing to have in hand." He smiled again. "Take the offer, Mrs. Vale. There's nothing up there but heartache and a roof that'll fall on you." And there it was, the thing that stopped her, though she could not yet have said why. It was not what he offered. It was the smoothness of the words good water, the way he laid them down and picked them back up too fast, the way a man does when he has said one true word too many in a sentence full of soft ones. Marta had read the honest and dishonest paperwork of the Kestrel Ford Creamery for 31 years, and she knew the difference between a man who wants a ruin gone and a man who wants it gone in a great hurry. And Fisk, for all his sorrow, was a man in a hurry. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't think too long," Fisk said, rising, still pleasant. "The county's demolition order won't wait on your feelings, Mrs. Vale, and neither, I'm afraid, will my company's interest." When he had gone, Marta sat a long while. Then her cousin came. Her cousin was Vernon Slake, a heavy, hearty, loud man who ran a milk-hauling business at the edge of town and had never had a thought he did not share at the top of his voice. He came with a bottle and a great deal of sympathy, and mourned Silas noisily, though he had not spoken to the old man in years, and then he came to his point. "Marta, honey, I'm going to talk to you like family, because somebody's got to," Vernon said, leaning his big forearms on her table. "That creamery is a stone around your neck, and you got no business up there alone at your age. Now I hear the Meridian people made you an offer. 800? That's real money, Marta. You take it, and you let me handle the paperwork so those company sharks don't skin you, and we'll get you set up in a nice little place down the valley. I'll bring a truck for the moving, no charge." "That's generous of you, Vernon," she said. "It's nothing. It's blood." He waved a hand. Old Silas, God rest him. He was a queer duck, Marta. You know it as well as I do. Sat back of that boarded-up cellar years after the co-op quit paying him, like a spider in a hole. Whatever he was doing all that time, it wasn't sense. Sign the thing, take the 800, don't be sentimental about a dead man's pile of stone. And there it was again, the little quick way he said whatever he was doing all that time, as if the ruin at the edge of the creek held something worth signing away in a hurry. What slipped out under Vernon's noise was that her cousin was very eager to be handling her paperwork before she had read a single sheet of Silas's herself. "I'll think about it," she said, for the second time in a week. Vernon's big face did something, a flicker, quickly covered with a grin. "Don't think too long, cuz," he said, and it was near enough word for word what the agent had said, and it did not sound any better in her cousin's mouth. "That kind of offer's got legs. It'll walk." When he had gone, Marta sat in the dark a long time. Then she found the ring of keys the county clerk had given her, Silas's keys, worn smooth with handling, and turned it under the lamp until she found the one that gave her pause, a great old flat-bitted iron key, long as her hand, its shank worn bright, oiled and clean when every other key was dull with disuse. Somebody had kept that one key working while all the others rusted, and Marta, who trusted arithmetic and mistrusted hurry. decided she would go and see her creamery before she signed a word away to anyone. She drove out to the Kestrel Ford Creamery the next morning in Silas's old truck, along the frozen valley road with the creek running silver and locked under ice on her left. The creamery stood at the edge of the creek where the water curved in against the ridge, longer than she remembered and far more ruined. A great gray fieldstone building leaning under its broad slate roof, its tall cold chimneys streaked with damp, its loading dock heaved by the frosts, its churn room windows boarded, its roof stove in along one whole slope. A county notice was nailed to the sagging office door. Condemned, no entry. Unsafe structure. Marta took the notice down. She put the long iron key in the office door lock, and it turned, stiff but sure, freshly oiled, as if it had been used within the week, and she understood that Silas had been coming and going through this door long after the town believed he had shut the creamery for good. She pushed the heavy door open on its complaint of hinges and stepped inside, into the dim and the dust and the deep cold smell of stone and old cream and cold iron. It was not the ruin the outside had promised. Someone had kept it. Not the roof, not the dock. Those were beyond one old man's hands. But the heart of it. The office floor was swept. The great oak bookkeeper's desk and the butter scales stood clean under their dust sheets, the milk book racks in order, the cream separators oiled, the little office stove blacked and laid ready with kindling, and on the shelf a mug and a plate washed and set to dry, as if the man who used them meant to come back. Silas had not given up the creamery. He had been keeping it, in secret, in the dark, for years, tending the cold heart of a factory that churned no cream. And Marta stood in the swept and waiting quiet of it with her dead brother-in-law's keys in her hand, and felt the ground of 30 years shift under her. "What were you doing, Silas?" she said aloud, to the cold, high room. "What were you doing back here all this time?" She went through to the manager's rooms above the churn floor, and they told her more, and gentler, than any word he had ever spoken to her. The rooms were spare and clean and lived in, his cot made, his few clothes on their pegs, and on the table by the window, held down against the draught by a smooth creek stone, was a photograph she had never seen, Corwin and Silas as young men, in the collarless shirts of another time, standing together on this very dock with a wagon of shining cream cans behind them, Corwin laughing, and beside him a younger Silas with one stiff hand on his brother's shoulder and on his gaunt face, caught by the camera in a way she had never once caught it in life, something that was unmistakably, achingly, love. She sat down on the edge of the made cot with the picture in her hands. He had kept it by his pillow all those years, the man who never told her he was glad she had married his brother, and she understood that whatever he had been doing in the dark of this creamery, he had done it in the one place where the brothers had ever been young and glad together. "You could have told me," she said to the photograph. "Whatever it was, you closed up, old fool. You could have let me help you carry it." But there was one thing in the plant she had not tried. Down the stone steps behind the office, past the low-arched aging cellar where the wheels of cheese had once ripened on their racks, stood a great old cold vault, a fireproof strong room of dressed stone and iron built into the cellar wall, its heavy door black and square and taller than she was, faced with a maker's plate worn near to nothing. And it was the only thing in the whole creamery that had a combination lock and a keyed handle both. And Marta, who had every sensible reason to go back to town, took the photograph and put it in her coat, and lit the office lamp and went down into the cold cellar to see what her husband's brother had kept locked in the stone. None of the keys on the ring fit the vault's keyed handle, and she had no combination at all, and for a moment she nearly wept with the smallness of it, to have come all this way to a locked iron door she could not open. Then she remembered the way Silas hid things, always in plain sight, because he trusted his own silence to keep off anyone who did not belong. And she thought of the photograph and the smooth creek stone that held it down, and she went back up and lifted the stone and turned it over, and there, Scratched into the flat underside in Silas's own small square figures, worn but plain, was a line of numbers, and beside it a small flat key taped with a strip of waxed cloth. The numbers were the combination. She carried the lamp back down and dialed them by its light with her breath held, right and left and right, and felt the wheels drop into line, and fitted the small flat key to the handle, and turned, and the great iron door of the cold vault came open on its heavy hinge, and Marta raised the lamp, and looked at what her brother-in-law had kept there in the dark, and did not understand at first what she was looking at. There was no fortune. That was her first thought, quick and ashamed. Some part of her had hoped, dialing the wheels, for banded bills, for the answer to the arithmetic that spelled fear. There was no fortune. There was paper. The great vault was lined with it, ordered and dry, shelf on shelf of butter ledgers, a long tin document box, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth on the topmost shelf where the damp could never reach it, and, low in the bottom, one small heavy strongbox of dull iron. Marta lifted the first ledger into the lamplight and began to read. They were the creamery's books. Butter ledgers bound in cracked cloth, and when she opened the oldest, the pages were filled with a cramped brown hand older than Silas's, dated before the century turned, then a hand she did not know, and then, on to the end, Silas's own small square writing, the same figures she had checked against her own for 20 years. It was a record of the co-op, every patron who ever hauled cream to Kestrel Ford, every pound of butter and wheel of cheese ever set down, 60 years of the valley's milk written down season by season, and it did not stop when the plant went cold. The last ledger ran on past the year the churn stilled, and the entries changed, no more cream, but instead the ground, every month for years, the state of the creek and the roof, the survey stakes the strangers left, the men who came to walk the water. The last entry was dated 9 days before he died, and it said only, Meridian's men set stakes on the creek again. They mean to have the ground and the cold spring under it. Let them come. The deed and the charter are in the vault where they have always been, and the ground and the water are ours in fee, not the company's, and a veil will be standing on it. S.V. O. Silas, Marta said. Oh, you close-mouthed old man. What is all this? She opened the long tin document box. Inside, laid flat in order, were the creamery's papers going back 60 years, the original cooperative agreements, the survey plats of the creek strip, the county tax rolls copied out in a careful hand. And clipped to a plat of the creek, dated in Silas's hand this very winter, was a tracing he had made showing the line the combine stakes ran. Straight up the creek strip to the mouth of the cold spring that fed it below the ridge, where a red penciled note read, Spring water and bottling, they mean to dam the creek and pipe the whole cold spring down the valley to their plant and leave the dairies dry. Marta ran her finger up the penciled line, and a cold understanding began in her that had nothing to do with the cold of the cellar. Her husband's brother had not been a mad old spider keeping a dead factory. He had been watching the strangers plan to dam the cold creek and pipe away the spring that watered every dairy in the valley, and writing it all down, and waiting for them to come, so a veil would be standing on the ground when they did. But it was the bundle in the oilcloth, on the highest shelf, that changed everything. Marta lifted it down and unwound the waxy cloth on the cellar floor, and inside was a stiff leather folder, gone dark at the corners, and inside that, the papers her brother-in-law had wrapped against fire and damp and kept dry for longer than she had been married. The topmost was old, the paper heavy and cottony, the ink faded to sepia, and across the head of it in an ornate clerk's hand it read, Deed of Grant A&D Articles of Cooperative, and below that the names of the founding dairy families of Kestrel Ford, and a date, 1902. Marta read it 3 times before she trusted her eyes. In the dense language of another century, it granted and conveyed to the Kestrel Ford Cooperative Creamery, to the members and their heirs and assigns forever the creamery ground and the whole spring-fed strip of the creek, including the cold spring at its head, in fee simple, in consideration of their keeping a public creamery for the dairies of the valley, not a lease loaned to any buyer, but the ground and the water itself, deeded to the cooperative and its blood. So long as a creamery was kept there, no company had ever owned the ground or the cold spring at Kestrel Ford. The founding families had deeded it to the members, to the Vales among them, who had kept it for 60 years, and it had never been the co-op's mere property to lose. It was held in fee by the members who kept the light in the window. To the keeper of the creamery, to the parcel she had bought, 5 days a widow of her own working life, for $164. To her, as the last member who would stand and keep it. And clipped behind the 1902 grant, in a chain of yellowed conveyances and co-op minute books, the membership came down the years with the plant, patron to patron, into the Vale name, then to Silas, and then, in the plainest and newest deed of all, dated only 2 years before, a conveyance Silas had had drawn quietly at a lawyer's in the county seat, assigning the whole of his interest in the Kestrel Ford Creamery and every foot of ground and water that ran with it to his brother's widow, Marta Vale, to take effect on his death. He had left her a will, after all. He had just left it where only a person who cared enough to open the cold vault would ever find it. And clipped to the very back of the folder, the newest papers of all, was a bundle that made Marta's hands go still. Tax receipts. Dozens of them. For years, quietly, Silas Vale, who the town thought had no money and lived on coal and lamp oil, had been paying off the back taxes on the little failing dairies strung along the cold creek, the herds and old milk houses that had fallen behind when the co-op wound down, buying up their liens one at a time and telling no one, not the owners, not the county, not her. "You spent everything," Marta whispered. "Every cent the co-op ever paid you. All those years. On this." She understood this much, kneeling in the cold of the cellar with the lamp throwing her brother-in-law's secret up the stone walls, that Silas Vale had not been a broken old man who let his creamery die and sat there going strange. He had been holding something in the dark, alone, for years, the oldest deed in the valley, the record of a company coming to take the water, the mortgages of his failing neighbors. And the Meridian Combine wanted the creek ground very badly, and her cousin Vernon was very eager to handle her paperwork before she read a word. Perhaps that was the hurry. She had not opened the small heavy strongbox low in the bottom of the vault. She drew it out now into the lamplight, and the small flat key opened it too, and inside, wrapped in a rotted canvas patronage sack, was a weight of dull coin, old gold and silver, a few $100 by the heft, and pinned to the sack a faded co-op patronage roll, 40 years old, marking it the unpaid dividends of a year the plant had run short. The shares of patrons dead before the money could be counted back to them, left in the creamery's keeping because that is what a cooperative creamery was, the place the whole valley trusted to hold what belonged to its members until the right hands came for it. Silas had held it 30 years and spent not a coin of it, though the town thought he starved. It was not his to spend, and he had kept it the way he kept everything. In the vault, in the dark, in trust. Marta looked at the old coin a long moment and did not think, "This is my answer to the arithmetic." She thought, "This too he kept. Even this." She did not sign anything. She drove back to Kestrel Ford that afternoon with the deed and the plat wrapped in her coat, and went not to the agent and not to her cousin but to the one honest lawyer in town, an old man named Renwick who had drawn wills and deeds in the county for 40 years, and laid the grant on his desk and watched a lawyer's face change. "Where did you get this?" Renwick said, very quietly when he had read it through twice. "My husband's brother kept it in the creamery," Marta said. "In the cold vault. Is it real?" Renwick got up and shut his office door, which he had not troubled to do when she came in. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "if this is what it appears to be, and I'll want to send to the county recorder to be certain the chain's unbroken, then it is worth a very great deal more than any creamery. Do you understand what it means that the ground and the cold spring at Kestrel Ford were granted in fee to the cooperative, and never to any company or to the receiver to sell? Tell me plain, Mr. Renwick. I make butter. I don't read law. He sat back down. It means, he said, that neither the receiver nor the Meridian Combine ever owned the land the plant stands on, nor one drop of the cold spring that feeds the creek. The founding families deeded the creamery ground and the spring strip to the cooperative, in fee simple, back in 1902, the strongest title there is, on the one condition that a public creamery be kept there. The receivership was only ever winding up the co-op's debts and gear. It never had the ground or the water to sell, because those were held in fee by the members. And a fee grant of the ground and the spring, he tapped the deed, his finger not quite steady, is not a thing a company can buy off a court that never held it. When the receiver closed the plant, the ground and the water stayed with the cooperative and the last member who keeps it. He looked up at her. That is you, Mrs. Vale, not the county, not the receiver to sell, and most certainly not the Meridian Dairy Combine. The room was very quiet. Marta heard the word settle. The Meridian Combine, she said slowly. Their agent offered me $800 for the parcel. He said the company likes to hold ground along the cold springs. That good water's a fine thing to have in hand. Renwick's mouth went thin. I'd expect he did, he said. Mrs. Vale, I'll tell you what half this town hasn't put together. Because they don't read the county's water filings, and I do. The Meridian Company hasn't been buying up creek ground to be neighborly. They filed to build a bottling plant 40 miles down the valley, and a plant like that drinks water by the 100,000 gallons. And there is exactly one cold spring in this county big enough and high enough to pipe down to them under its own fall. The spring at the head of your creek, straight above the creamery yard. They mean to buy the plant site cheap from the court, level the creamery, dam the creek, and lay their pipe down it, and dry every dairy in the Two Rivers Valley that waters its herd at that creek. And there is one thing standing in their way. He touched the old deed again. Someone who owns that ground and that spring in fee and will not sell. Your brother-in-law's title is older than the company and stronger than its money, and without the spring strip there is no pipe, and without the pipe no bottling plant. Silas wasn't hoarding. He was building a wall across that creek out of old paper, one deed at a time, to keep a company from draining the valley dry. And he died before he could tell a soul. Marta sat in the old lawyer's office and felt the last piece of it lock into place, and it was not about her at all, and never had been. Vernon with his bottle and his sympathy and his truck offered free for the moving, so quick to have her sign before she read a word. Vernon, who ran a milk hauling business at the edge of town. Mr. Renwick, she said. My cousin Vernon has a milk and trucking business. Wanted to handle all my paperwork on the creamery. Is there any way to know whether my cousin hauls for the Meridian Dairy Combine? Renwick was quiet a moment. I don't know, he said. But I think, Mrs. Vale, that you had better let me find out before you put your name on one single thing that man sets in front of you. And in the meantime, he gathered the deed and the plat carefully, reverently, into his folder. I think you had better not sell that creamery to anybody. For any money, and I think you had better decide whether you mean to fight. She drove home in the early dark, the frozen creek running bright and cold beside her under the ridge, and she understood what she was going to do. Silas had run out of time. Now it was hers, and she would not sell it, and above all she would do the one thing the whole title quietly turned upon. Because a creamery deeded in fee, Renwick had told her, held on the one condition that a creamery be kept, a public works, open to the dairies of the valley. 2 years the plant had stood dark and boarded. 2 years no one had kept the light. She was going to open the creamery again. Because the deed and the charter held so long as a creamery was kept there, and because somewhere ahead, in a spring that had not come yet, The company was going to come up the valley to level the plant and dam the creek, and Marta meant to be standing on the dock of an open, lighted, lawfully kept creamery, with the oldest paper in the county in her hand, when it did. The town, when it heard what the Vale woman intended, did exactly what her brother-in-law had spent his silent years learning it would do. It laughed. Not unkindly. Kestrel Ford was not a cruel town, but thoroughly, over coffee and across counters, the soft, sad laughter of practical people at a foolish woman's folly. Marta Vale, who could not keep her own job when the co-op wound up, was going to open a creamery the court had shut, 62 years old, and keep a lamp burning for milk wagons that would never come. She had taken her losses hard, they said. Small wonder, first Corwin, then the co-op, then poor strange Silas, and the kindest thing was to let it run its course until the cold and the loneliness brought her back to her senses and the Meridian Combine's $800. The laughter had a place, and the place was the feed store where the men gathered by the stove in the mornings. And Marta walked into the middle of it one bitter January day, come in for the things she needed to make the creamery fit to open: lamp oil, roofing felt, stovepipe, hardware for the doors and the broken windows. The talk stopped when the bell rang, the way talk stops when its subject walks in, then started again, lower, and she heard the word creamery and a low chuckle. And she read her list out plainly at the counter, and the storekeeper filled it without quite meeting her eye, because he was ashamed and did not know how to say so. It was one of the men by the stove who spoke, a man she knew a little named Dab Corliss, who said it to the room more than to her. Fixing up the old creamery? Marta, what's a body want with stovepipe and roofing felt for a plant with no cream? And when she did not answer at once, he pressed it, gently, the way a man presses a thing he is sure of. You're not truly going to try and open old Kestrel Ford. Tell me you're not. The co-ops wound up. The courts shut it. You're going to keep a churn floor warm for a milk wagon that's never coming. At 62. On $164? The room laughed, softly, and waited for her to be embarrassed. Marta took her change and put it in her coat, and then she turned and looked at Dab Corliss, and she was not embarrassed, and that was the thing that changed the sound in the room. Mr. Corliss, she said, you know that cold spring at the head of the creek, the one that waters every herd from here to the forks? Have you heard what the Meridian Company means to do with it? The man blinked, thrown, damn it, Marta said, into the quiet store. Dam the creek and pipe the whole cold spring 40 miles down the valley to a bottling plant, and leave the dairies of 2 rivers to water their cows out of a dry ditch. And do you know where they mean to run their pipe? Straight down the creek strip and through the middle of Kestrel Ford, your water and mine sold off by the gallon, and the herds this valley lives by gone dry inside a year. She let it sit a moment. There's one thing standing in their way. The creamery ground and the cold spring were deeded in fee, in 1902, to the cooperative and its members, not to any company, not to the court to sell. My husband's people. Me so long as the creamery's kept, the ground and the water are ours, and there's no pipe and no bottling plant without them. Silas knew. He tried to make this town understand for years, and it laughed at him the way you're laughing at me. I'm done being laughed out of a thing that's true. Good day. She walked out with the bell jangling behind her, and her ears did burn, because she had never in her life said so much at once to a room full of men. But behind her the feed store was quiet, and Dab Corliss was not laughing, and as she loaded the truck an older man she half knew came out after her, turning his cap in his hands, and asked, awkwardly, whether it was true about the deed, and whether that old paper of Silas's might reach far enough to keep the spring where it was. It was the first time anyone in Kestrel Ford had asked her a real question instead of giving her advice. Vernon did not laugh. Vernon came out to the creamery, where Marta had moved her one suitcase into the manager's rooms and begun her work, and this time there was less of the sympathy about him and more of something harder underneath. "You've been to Renwick," he said in the doorway. He did not sit. "You found the old man's papers." "I found my husband's brother's papers," Marta said, "in my husband's brother's creamery." "Yes, Marta," he spread his big hands, "reasonable, warm, and only a little too fast. Whatever that old lawyer told you those papers are worth, Renwick's behind the times. That grant won't hold up. The co-op ran that plant on that ground for 60 years, and it's wound up and shut by a court now. That's the receiver's to sell. Any company lawyer will run circles around a scrap of founder's paper from 1902. You'll spend money you don't have on a fight you'll lose, and lose the 800 besides. Let me take it off your hands, cuz I'll better their offer. 1,200. Cash, out of my own pocket, this week. Take it, and go be comfortable, and let an old crazy man's fight die with him. Where it belongs. And there it was, $1,200 from Vernon's own pocket this week, cash, for a 60-year-old scrap of paper he had just finished telling her was worthless. Marta looked at her cousin filling the low doorway of the creamery, and she was not quite angry. She was something colder and clearer than angry. "Silas knew," she said. "That's it, isn't it, Vernon? He knew what the Meridian Combine was, and he knew what you were. And he spent every dollar he had buying up this ground one lien at a time, so that when the watermen came, there'd be a veil holding the oldest paper in Kestrel Ford to stand across the creek. He couldn't make the town listen, so he made sure the town couldn't sell what it didn't understand it had. And you've been hauling for that company, haven't you? Waiting for the strange old man to die so you could get the creamery away from me before I ever opened the vault and found out what I was sitting on." Vernon's big face closed like a door. "You're a laid-off widow alone on a ruin," he said, "and all the warmth was gone out of it now. You've got no money and no work and no man to stand up for you. You can't fight the company, and you can't fight the court, and you can't fight me. Be smart, Marta. Take the 1,200 while it's on the table. Get out of my husband's brother's creamery," she said. He went. And Marta shut the great door behind him, and stood in the cold and the dust with her heart going hard, and knew she had just turned down 7 times the money in her whole possession from her own bloodkin, and that she was, by every measure Kestrel Ford lived by, a fool. Then she took the oldest butter ledger from the vault, lit the lamp, and began to learn how to make a dead creamery live. It was not simple, and no one helped her at first. The roof leaked along one whole slope, the loading dock was heaved and split, the churn room doors hung off their rollers, and the great work floor was so cold her breath hung in it. But Silas, Marta came to see as she read his ledgers by lamplight, had understood the creamery's salvation, and left the way of it written down. She could not make it the busy plant of 40 dairies again. Those days were gone. But a creamery was a creamery because a keeper kept it open and warm and public, and that needed nothing the valley and a pair of hands could not supply. The office stove was sound. The walls were fieldstone 2 feet thick and would stand another 100 years. What had failed was the roof and the doors and the will to open them, and all of that a patient person could mend, because it was made of wood and felt and tin and stubbornness and not of money, and no man could tell her she might not repair what was already hers. So Marta mended it. She climbed up in the still cold days, and nailed roofing felt over the worst of the broken slope, her fingers stiff and bleeding a little into the frost, until the work floor stopped taking snow. She set the churn room doors back on their rollers, glazed the broken windows 1 pane at a time, and blacked the great office stove and lit it. And the first evening the office came warm around her, she sat in it alone with a lamp in the window and the wind off the ridge finding no way in, and felt the creamery wake the way a cold house wakes when a fire is finally lit in it. She swept the dock and salted the ice, and hung a board by the door in her own square hand, Kestrel Ford Creamery, open. And one gray morning in February she unlocked the office door at first light and left it unlocked, and lit the lamp, and for the first time in years the Kestrel Ford Creamery was an open, lighted, lawfully kept works, exactly as the 1902 deed required, whether a single wagon of cream ever came or not. It came open. And an odd thing happened, slowly through February and into March. As the word went round that the creamery was lit and warm again, and the widow Vale kept it open every day, the old people began to come. Not the men with an eye on the company's money, but the old ones, the ones who still remembered when the milk wagons lined the dock at dawn and the whole valley lived by the churns, the ones whose fathers had carried the first cream to Kestrel Ford when the co-op was new. They came up the creek road by ones and twos, cap in hand, and stood in the warm office and said awkward, halting things. My father hauled the first can of cream this creamery ever took in, an old man named Ansel Roon told her, turning his cap in his hands. He had been the head buttermaker on the line before Marta's time, and had taught her the churns her first year. Charter Day, 1902. When Silas let it go dark, folks said the day of Kestrel Ford was done. He looked at the lit lamp and the warm stove, and something worked in his weathered face. There's talk in the county, Marta. They say Meridian means to dam the creek and pipe the cold spring down to a bottling plant. A man who hauls survey chain for them has seen the maps. Is it true what you told Dab Corliss? About the old deed? About the ground and the water being the co-ops and not the companies? It's true, Mr. Roon, Marta said. The grant's dated 1902. It deeds this ground and the cold spring in fee to the cooperative and whoever keeps the creamery older than the company. Older than any of it. The court could wind up our debts, but it never owned the ground or the spring to sell. So long as the creamery's kept open, the water reverts to no one. It stays the valleys, whole and clear, and there's no pipe and no plant without the spring it has to cross. I don't need a single wagon of cream to keep the deed alive, only to keep the creamery open. And I mean to. She watched the old man's mouth fall open. My husband's brother left me everything he knew, and I mean to keep the door open. After that, they helped her. Roon and two other old creamery men brought ladders and slate up the creek road and began, on the still days, to mend the roof she could not finish alone. A retired co-op secretary named Ida Farrow, who had kept the charter and the minute books in the good years and knew every article and bylaw the cooperative had ever passed, went through Silas's tin box with her and taught her the words she would need: fee simple, cooperative in perpetuity, patronage, reversion, the way Renwick had begun to teach her the law of it. The old dairy families and the little holders along the creek whose liens Silas had quietly bought and meant them to have back, formed themselves without ever quite saying so into the friends of a creamery the county still called condemned, and Marta, who 2 months before had been a laid-off buttermaker alone with a suitcase, found she was a creamery keeper again, and the reason a dairy valley full of frightened people had remembered they were not helpless. And then, in the last week of May 1965, the spring Silas had written into his ledger came for the town in earnest, and the Meridian Combine came up the valley to take the ground and the water. It happened the way Ida Farrow had said it would. The Combine sent a crew to pull down the creamery and clear the plant site, and behind them came the company's men with their transit and their stakes and a steam shovel on a lowboy to throw an earth dam across the cold creek the moment the plant was down, and a company lawyer with the receiver's bill of sale for the site bought cheap from a court glad to be rid of a dead co-op. The whole thing lawful looking as a Sunday. On a raw, bright May morning, the wrecking crew reached the head of the creek, and the company's steam shovel came grinding up the grade behind, and the town of Kestrel Ford woke to the sound of a valley being made ready to be drained. But the ground they had bought was not the court's to sell. Marta was in the creamery when Ida Farrow brought her the word, red-faced and out of breath from the walk. "They've come," she said. The Combine's crew's throwing a fence round the plant to pull it down, and their shovels right behind fixing to dam the creek. Marta, if that old deed is ever going to be worth anything, it's worth it today. Or it's worth nothing ever. Renwick's gone for the county surveyor and the recorder's map. But it's your ground. It has to be you that stands on it. Marta took Silas's ledger of the survey stakes, and the plat of the creek with the company's own line traced on it, and the 1902 deed in its oilcloth, and made sure the lamp was lit in the creamery window, and the office door stood open, and the board hung plain by it. Kestrel Ford Creamery, open, so any man could see a works lawfully kept, and then walked up the creek to where the wrecking crew was stringing its fence, and the shovel stood idling at the head of her ground, and found the county surveyor already there. A spare, tired official named Hollis, whose thankless job it was to say where one man's ground ended and another's began. And the agent, Fisk, and a company lawyer in a city suit, Mrs. Vale Fisk said, and the sorrow was all gone out of him now, and something tighter had come into his smooth face at the sight of her. This is a lawful purchase. The company holds the receiver's grant to the plant site, filed and in order. There's nothing for you here. Mr. Hollis, Marta said past him, to the surveyor, and she did not raise her voice, because she had Renwick's coaching and the deed in her hand and knew, to the letter, where the line ran. My name is Marta Vale. I own the Kestrel Ford Creamery, and the ground it stands on, and the whole of the creek strip and the cold spring these men are standing over. I've come to show you the title. She held out the oilcloth bundle. This is a deed of grant and articles of cooperative, from the founding families of Kestrel Ford to the members of this creamery and their heirs forever, in fee simple, dated 1902 and recorded the same year. No company and no court ever owned this ground or this water. The receiver wound up the co-op's debts and gear. It never held the fee to the land or the spring, which was the members, to sell. The moment they level this plant, they break the one condition the grant runs on, and until they do, the ground and the water are mine, whole and clear, in fee. She let it settle in the raw air. It is older than the company by 60 years, and no man dams that creek, or takes 1 gallon off that spring over it, without me. By the deed in your hand, my ground begins where these men are standing. The surveyor took the deed in his cold, reddened hands and read it again, and Marta watched a weary official come slowly, disbelievingly awake. He unrolled his own copy of the recorder's plat against the hood of his truck and laid the old grant's calls beside it, and did the arithmetic of a boundary a lifetime of the work had made automatic in him, the same way Marta did the arithmetic of a ledger, and there was no other answer in it, and he knew it. This is genuine? Hollis said. This is recorded? 1902? In fee? The spring too? It's recorded, Marta said. Mr. Renwick's confirmed the chain with the recorder, member to member unbroken, down to me. It's on file. It's real. And that creamery has stood open and lawfully kept these 3 months, with the lamp lit and the door unlocked, in front of the whole town, so no man can tell you it was abandoned or the condition of the grant broken. The deed holds, and the ground and the water under these men's feet is mine. The company's lawyer began, then, the argument she had known was coming, the one Vernon had thrown at her in the doorway, that the co-op's long shutdown and the court's wind-up had ripened the site into the receivers to sell, that a scrap of founder's paper from 1902 could not stand against a court decree and a live bill of sale. And it frightened Marta, because it turned Silas's long silent keeping into the weapon against him. But she had Renwick come up the grade behind her, dusty and grim and holding the recorder's certified map, and the answer was the deed and the keeping both. The receiver wound up a cooperative's debts, not its land, Renwick said, laying the certified plat on the surveyor's truck beside the old grant, and a court cannot sell what the failed co-op never owned in the first place. The ground and the spring were granted in fee to the members, in perpetuity, not to the cooperative as a thing that dies when its books do. The grant of 1902 is recorded, the membership chain unbroken into Mrs. Vale's hands, and its one condition that a public creamery be kept, has been met without a break, Her brother-in-law kept this plant every year of the 2 the town thought it dark, and my client has kept it open, warm and lit, these 3 months before the whole town's eyes." He turned to the company's man. "You bought a plant site from a receiver who never held the fee. Over ground and water the co-op never owned to lose. The moment your crew lays a hand to level it, you break the very condition. And until then the fee stands clear in Mrs. Vale. There was a right kept alive in the dark, by a man who knew this day was coming, and taken up in the open by the woman he left it to. The 1902 fee holds, and it stands across every foot of ground and every drop of water your company has to cross. The raw grade was very quiet, and old Roon, who had come up the creek behind Renwick with a dozen of the old creamery men and the little dairy holders off the failing line, stepped forward with his cap in his hands. I'll swear to it. So'll every man here. Silas Vale kept that creamery and that ground in his own way every year of them 2, and we let the town call him crazy for it, and we were wrong. You want to say nobody kept the Kestrel Ford Creamery alive? You say it to us." A low sound of agreement went round the men, and the surveyor looked at the deed, and the certified plat, and the cold spring at the head of the creek, and asked the company's lawyer very quietly for the calls in his bill of sale. It was not the law, in the end, that broke it, though the law was on her side. It was the plain fact of the line. Hollis had spent his life running boundaries by the arithmetic of what the record said, and the arithmetic was not close. He confirmed the Vale fee on the spot, pending the court's formal word, and told the wrecking crew they might do nothing at all, that they could not set a blade or a fence to ground that was not theirs, nor throw a dam across water the company did not own, which meant, because the pipe could not cross the creamery ground and the spring without Marta's leave, and she would not give it, that the bottling plant 40 miles down the valley had no water to drink, and a bottling plant with nothing to bottle is no plant at all. By that evening the steam shovel was back on its lowboy and gone down the valley, and the cold spring ran clear as it had run since before the town, and the dairies of 2 rivers watered their herds at a creek that was plainly and lawfully the valley's own again. After that, the fight went out of the other side all at once, the way a fire goes out when the wind that fed it turns. It is one thing for a company to argue a strange old man off a dead creamery. It is another thing entirely to argue, in front of a whole dairy valley, that the oldest deed in the county should be set aside so a company could dam the creek and pipe away the cold spring that watered every herd from the town to the forks. The Combine withdrew its claim to the site, and the county recorder and the district court confirmed, in a decree Renwick read aloud at the courthouse that summer, that the 1902 grant to the members of the Kestrel Ford Cooperative Creamery was genuine, recorded, and, in good standing, a fee-simple title to the creamery ground and the spring-fed creek strip, held lawfully and clearly by Marta Vale. Which meant the great land grab was dead. A dairy combine cannot pipe a spring it has no ground to lay its line across, when the one strip of creek and the spring at its head belong in fee to a woman who will not sell them for any money, and Marta would not. The Meridian Dairy Combine took its transit and its steam shovel to a river with an easier taking and no old paper in its way, and Vernon Slake, whose milk firm had indeed, as Renwick's inquiries established, held a fat contract to haul for the company's new plant, a contract now worth nothing, left Kestrel Ford not long after and did not come back, and if Marta grieved that, she grieved it quietly, and never once spoke his name in the town. Wallace Prine, the receiver, came up the valley that summer, after the spring was safe, and stood on the mended dock with his good hat in his hands, and did not quite know how to say the thing he had come to say. "I walked you out of this creamery with an envelope and a handshake, Mrs. Vale," he managed at last. He looked at the lit lamp, the warm office, the swept and open dock. "I've thought about that since the company near took the spring. If I'd had my way, you'd have taken the 800 and been gone, and this creamery would be a company's pump house, and that spring in a pipe 40 miles off instead of running for the valley." He turned the hat. "I came to say I'm sorry. To your face. "You are winding up what the court told you to wind up, Mr. Prine," Marta said. "And you did give me an envelope, which is more than the creamery ever will." She did not say the thing she might have said, which was that the sensible, unanimous advice of the whole town had very nearly let a valley be drained dry in a pipe. She had learned from a dead man's ledgers that being right is not the same as needing to be told you were right, and that the only use of the ground was to keep it whole and open, not to hold it over anyone. "Come in out of the wind," she said instead. "The stove's lit. I'll give you a cup of coffee, and you can tell me whether the county would help a little co-op get back on its churns, because I mean to see this valley live off more than the memory of milk wagons." She did not gloat. She had been walked out of her life's work with a handshake, pitied at the feed store, and pressed by her own blood to sign away the one thing Silas had died to keep, and when the whole of it turned and ran the other way, she took no pleasure in the turning. When the Meridian Combine's own lawyers, red-faced, came at last to ask whether she would sell them even a narrow easement across the creek strip for their pipe, she heard them out courteously, and said no, and kept the ground and the water whole and in the valley where they belonged. And she did with Silas's creek the thing she understood, now he had always meant to do. She held the liens he had bought up on the little failing dairies, and one by one, as she was able, she cleared them or handed them back, not for a profit she needed, but to the families who worked the land, at the price Silas had paid the taxes for, so that the ground the company had meant to swallow belonged, at the end, to the people of Kestrel Ford. And the old patronage coin she had found, held 40 years in trust, she would not spend either, she gave it, with the patronage roll and the whole account of it, into the county's keeping to be paid out rightfully as Silas had held it. Because a thing left in trust is not a windfall. She kept the office warm and the lamp lit through that winter and every winter after. For the drovers and drifters and stranded travelers who came in off the hard valley road with no place to go, and gave them the bench by the stove and a hot cup and asked them nothing, the way, she found written in the oldest ledgers, the first keepers of Kestrel Ford had done for wayfarers long before her. The dying town did not die. It came back, slowly, the way the creamery had come back, one mended thing at a time, a handful of the valley dairies bringing their cream to the churns again by that next spring. And above it the cold spring ran clear off the ridge for the herds of 2 rivers, and the lamp in the creamery window burned every night for whoever came up the valley in the dark. Marta Vale kept the creamery for the rest of her life. She never got her old place back on a paying co-op, and found she did not much want it. She had a creamery on a cold creek, and a lamp to light, and a reason, every evening to set it in the window. She was not rich in the way the town measured riches, though never again poor in the way that had spelled fear at her rented table, for a valley whose water she had saved does not forget. But that was not why she kept the light. She kept it for the same reason Silas had blacked the stove and oiled the churns of a plant with no cream, because the ground and the water belonged to everyone who came after, and the difference between a valley that stood and a valley drained off in a pipe was one old deed kept alive and one door, kept open by a person who had decided that keeping it was worth whatever it cost. She never emptied the cold vault. She left the ledgers and the deed behind its great door where Silas had kept them, and added to them her own creamery ledger now, in her own square hand under his, year after year, the record going on unbroken as it had for 60 years. And she understood, keeping it, the whole of what her husband's brother had been trying to tell her in the only language he had, which was not words but keeping, that the money had never been the point. That what a person leaves is not what they hoard, but what they keep alive and open for the ones who come after. They found her, years on, an old woman by then, in the keeper's chair by the vault with a creamery ledger open in her lap and the lamp still burning in the window, gone quietly the way Silas had gone, with her work done and the door open. And the town of Kestrel Ford, which had once laughed, did not laugh. The people came up the creek road in the gray dawn and stood bareheaded on the mended dock. And one of them went in and lit the lamp she kept against the last of the dark, and then they went home. And that night some hand that was not hers blacked the stove and set the lamp in the creamery window, and kept the door open onto the valley. And some hand has kept it open ever since. Because that was the thing Marta Vale finally understood, kneeling long ago in the cold of the cellar over her brother-in-law's oilcloth bundle, that a valley and a light in a window and the oldest deed to a piece of ground and the water that runs through it are not possessions. They are a promise. It is the promise a person makes in the dark, at their own cost, to a stranger they will never meet, coming up a hard road out of the cold with nothing left but the hope that someone ahead kept a door open for them. Silas had made that promise, and kept it in silence until it took his whole strange life, and Marta had found it behind the stone and taken it up and kept it in the open until it saved them all. And the promise did not end with either of them. It was never meant to. Keep the door open. Keep the stove lit and a lamp in the window for the one who comes up out of the dark with nothing. The creamery is still open. Somebody made sure of it. Somebody always has.